for the coming research season, summer, sometimes, as I like to think of it, I wanted to give a small reboot to the talk I gave last year about not only how to do research as a first-time researcher, but also how to enjoy it, how to hopefully get something a little more than what's prescribed to you by the program. And so I did this last year for some REU students over at CEBC, which I'll talk about in a moment, a research unit at the University of Kansas. But this will contrast to what I'm doing this year, working with an individual student at a small private liberal arts school. So very different scales of programs and what to expect. And so we'll try to extract what is similar between them from some of the experiences that I've had. And so to start, I always like to motivate my students by thinking about not only where they are, but the resources around them. When I was in Kansas, this was most evident with physical resources, right? Things like all of the agricultural outputs, access to solar and wind for energy, oil and gas. A lot of these sectors converge in a place that you don't really think about, right? In terms of, well, maybe very often at all. But I really appreciated, right, how programs like these summer research programs put people in rooms with different researchers and industrialists and scientists from different sectors. And so that was a neat opportunity, right, for students in maybe larger programs that are taking, maybe not taking trips right now, but maybe doing video calls with people from different sectors or areas. And this contrasts again with where I am right now, thinking more about, right, not only New York City, the region I'm in, but perhaps resources related more to networks and social organizations, right, to the commerce that's nearby, thinking about maybe industrializing certain aspects of our chemistry, looking at maybe different traditions with regards to chemistry or how science is perceived. A lot of outreach components will look at, right, connecting people from different places. And then, right, physical location is going to be prime for some of the chemistry we do, and there will be, I guess, specific chemistry related to the regions we're in, maybe pollution, for example, for New York. And so, you can generalize this in some ways to your area and then make it specific, right? Not only to perhaps, other professors in your program or, people you may know that you can talk to, other colleagues or cohort members, but then also thinking about at the university at large, right, what their strengths are and what you can use in terms of their resources. And so the question of what we're doing here is going to be specific to whichever project you've been applied to. Maybe you wrote an application, maybe you pitched for just a certain mentor, but the specifics are going to be left up to, right, the glory of your topic, and then also what we're able to do this summer practically. There's the hope we may transition back into the lab, but we should expect, right, to be looking mostly at the internet as, right, our greatest data or access to data. And so, this is also going to be a question that you may ask yourself more generally, with regards to why am I doing this, research or this project? And that's going to be one that only really you can answer. And it may go long beyond, say, an individual summer of research. I still ask myself this about my projects, about, as an educator, what am I doing here? But you're going to want to have, at any point, a good answer to this just to help motivate yourself. So think about not only why you applied, but also what you can do with the skills that you're going to learn. And so I start off most of my lectures, I will admit, with some background to how not only we learn, but also we do research. And so I want to kind of compare and contrast the traditional learning model on the left, Bloom's taxonomy, and the scientific method, which is really what you're here to do and begin to, practice more rigorously. Maybe you've had some science background research, maybe none at all, and that's okay, right? Many of us have really varied experiences, and those still add to what we're doing. So just looking briefly at what's on the left, when I make an exam, for example, maybe early on in the semester, it'll be mostly the bottom part of those pyramids, right? Maybe you define a term that we've been talking about, or you relate and compare two concepts. Relatively simple things that I could be asking. And then later in the semester, as we build towards projects and things, right, you'll be analyzing data, putting it together, maybe coming up with conclusions. And so this is the flow of, we think about the complexity of the work that we give our students, but also the progression you go through in your learning journey, right? Hopefully, eventually, at the end of most of your courses or years or classes, you come out with some project or some takeaway. And it's a linear thought, right? It is this singular direction. And so what I think is neat is that we can kind of bend this arrow around into the cycle we have on the right, and it matches pretty well. So a lot of what you've been doing up until this point, learning in school, is very useful, but it is also still somewhat different from what we're about to do now. Often in your studies up until this point, we've really been led in a specific direction. Science is very different. We're going to find, engineering too, that you may often think you're going in the right direction, but you're going to have to pivot. And so this cycle, the scientific method, is very useful for that. No doubt you've seen it before, right? We typically start at the hypothesize stage. That's going to be the project you proposed. Then you're going to come up with ideas and then experiments and then do them. You'll assess that data. You will determine, what it's saying, and then hopefully you'll share that in some way, sort of like the create on the left. And so, these are the steps that you probably even memorized, but we'll find that it's often not a simple cycle. We're going to often go between them as new things come up, as problems arise. And so we'll sort of explore that as expected, right? But also as these patterns underlying how we go through our research. So if you're ever super lost, you can return and to sort of one of these steps, be like, what am I supposed to be doing right now? Oh, right, I'm checking the data to see what correlates. That's qualify. Okay, well, what am I going towards? Well, I want to share it, so it should be accessible and easy to understand. Things like that. So I also love summer research because it often usually comes with a theme. So this could be, say, your RU program has structure to it, right, a focus, or something's going on, like, all the kind of stuff we're living through right now. And so sometimes inevitably things are kind of drawn towards that. One of the sort of themes of the research center I worked with that helped host this RU program was the premise of going really from the bench scale, so what you'd be doing in lab that summer, to a very industrial scale, very large. So sort of from the milligram up to the gram and then to the kilogram scale, as we like to think about it. But really the challenge that they added to this was to do this not only safely, right, make sure people don't blow up while they're making the chemicals, but also sustainably, so that in however many years, right, we can still be living and producing and all that good stuff. And so, right, it's good to have a very big frame to what you're doing, to have something to kind of look forward towards, right, or refer back to. I would say, and I love to do this, is theme it to the organization you're at, right? The resources they have, the perspective they take. So even if your problem doesn't directly relate to this theme, right, or the organization, that's a great challenge to take, right? See what connections can be made, and I would bet that there are some to find. A slightly different perspective is one that I'll probably be taking a little bit more at my school this year with my colleague that I'll be working with. And so rather than thinking perhaps about scale, which is very important, a perspective in many disciplines, I'm very focused on looking at different perspectives. So at my school, we don't have a research center, or the capabilities of a large public institution, but we do have this wonderful confluence, I guess you would say, of it's a liberal arts school, but we're also kind of polytechnic in that we have engineering, and so we have all these different mindsets, and so it might be neat to get different perspectives on your problem, especially if you're kind of stuck for an idea, right? Have other people pick it apart with their expertise and see what kind of comes out. And so, I can go to, we do have a small center at Manhattan College. I shouldn't say small, right? We do a lot of good work, Cures. And so we have a representative really from, one of every flavor of types of classes. We have, I'm not sure if it was accounting, but in business. We have someone from, poli-sci and then sociology. And so picking their brains is also just as useful as digging back into the textbook at times. So that was our intro, right? Kind of thinking broadly and generally about this leap you're about to take. And so now we're going to go through a couple of different ideas, things that relate to safety, data management, and then I kind of themed this to relate to the stuff that we were looking at earlier, right? So we're going from these sort of simple ideas, things you may remember, to creating a bit of a plan for this year. And so we will start, no surprise, by looking at the literature. I will admit that was a large portion of my first, couple of years researching. It still is, right? finding good literature to read. Eventually it will start to come to you, but early on, right, you got to go out there and find it. I find this really becomes these days a question of how well you Google, right? Which terms you're using, how you're logging your searches, so you can go back and check for things. But academic literature here represents typically things like papers, maybe communications, letters, in a variety of different journals, right? But they've been peer reviewed. And this is the somewhat gold standard of academic research. It's sort of the unit of research too. Often the goal is to publish a paper or a project will yield a paper, sort of one way to think of it. And this stuff is very difficult to read at first, right? So I find the toughest part is that early on you're really reading the whole thing and trying to get the idea of the paper, which is a good place to start, but it often is a lot to tackle. As a researcher now, often I will jump through parts of the paper and look at, say, the experimental or the results. And so you may find, right, as you're, say, maybe just starting to build methods, just reading method sections. Don't feel you have to worry about the entire thing. Though, introduction is always a great place to start with some background and finding other things to read for references. So I will admit, again, like over 65% of what's in my reference manager is probably academic literature. But more recently, I've also fallen in love with patent literature, in part because it is all free online, a sort of international database. You can use Google Patents. And even though these are also hard to read, right, they're purposefully made difficult to extract details of a process or ingredients. They are also, there's a lot of information in there. And so I actually have students who will go through patents almost primarily as their research, or as their data source to compare different industrial methods. Now again, just because something's patented doesn't mean that it was ending up being used, but it's a great comparison between some of the methods in the academic literature. And so last but not least, we can think about white papers, which I would say almost are more common in this era, right, where anyone can publish a PDF, right, desktop publishing. But nevertheless, there are going to be organizations that may not publish a formal article, or maybe in companion to an article have a report. And so this is going to be great data, often very recent and current data is in this form. And so a great place to go, often very bulky, lots of pages. But that's where the searching comes in. What word phrases are you looking for? How can you kind of best get to where you want to go? And so, don't make yourself crazy. Don't. I don't know. Well, by that I mean, I guess I would sometimes have piles of papers on my desk. In some labs, that's how they begin, right? You read through all this stuff before you start. Take your time to step away from it. You can always sort of focus on different areas that are most relevant to you. I guess what I mean to say is not every word in every paper needs to be read. And so you'll begin to practice the skill of determining what's important, which is probably, one of the biggest things as an advisor, as a mentor that I look for and I try to work with my students on is, when you're presented with, a conundrum of A or B, think about, which is the most important. And so that comes with the problems that you have too. If you can't access a paper after looking for it for days, might not be worth the rest of your time, or maybe you take a different approach. Anyway, that was a bit of a tangent. All I want to point out is that I'm a big believer in well-written articles having a blend of different types of resources, so not only academic perspectives or those from patents, but also maybe literature from slightly outside the field, and something like a white paper from an organization that looks at the impacts of something that you do. And so that'll start you off. And I will say that a well-read researcher, right, the phrase they say is, it's like a day in the library could save a week in the lab. So the premise is that there's a lot of work that's already out there, and so it can answer a lot of your questions. You just need to get to it. And so try to do a little bit of that first. And so I want to talk about lab notebooks, even though in this digital era, right, when we're at home, we may not start with a traditional physical lab notebook, but we will inevitably return to lab at some point, and they also serve as a really good tool to look at the kinds of things you need to sort of log any research, right, not just experimental research. So in every lab I've ever been in, right, I've been issued a notebook, or I brought one in at some point at the beginning, and then kept it through the duration of my time there. Generally, it was returned to the lab, or filed in case anybody needed to look at it later. I'm hoping that, right, some of you are maybe familiar with digital options. Those are wonderful, but no doubt, many instruments that you may work with will come with a composition notebook in front of it. And simple as it may be, the information inside is priceless at times. So you've also probably kept a notebook before, right? In an introductory lab class, maybe even in high school. And so we can go over some of the important points. We're going to have things like the date, right? To be able to look at this progression that you've gone through. You might have specific pieces of data. You might tape in, right, actual results. And then something else we're going to find is that generally each experiment is going to have a code that's related to the page and the date and then also your name, right? So we're going to be able to pinpoint exactly where it is. So we'll look at those, or the ways we come up with that later. But you'll notice here, right, that it's also saying the researcher signs and dates, in this case, each page, which is, right, the certification that not only is the data good, but it's, accurately represented, it's honest. And so, right, to not have a lab notebook earlier, even when we start at home, perhaps this summer, is not only going to be frustrating later on when we need to look back, but we also want to make sure we have the resources to show that the work we did was, up to par. And so this is, a structure we can keep even in an electronic format and maybe use later as well. I will admit that it takes time to, learn good practices with your lab notebook, but I will also admit that I have never been upset that I took the time to write something down in my lab notebook. It will always be worth it in the end. Sort of more generally, one of the techniques I use outside of the lab to keep me going and or sort of organized are going to be simple bullet lists or bullet journal, as many people have. So I do mine by day on Post-it note, and they usually have anywhere between 2 to 5 different things that I'm thinking about. Some days may have a lot of things, but the goal is you don't have to check all of them off every day, just to kind of have this list of things that you're continually thinking about, so you're kind of keeping all the balls in the air. I also like to keep these and then look back and see maybe there was something I missed, or how well I did in a week if I'm sort of slacking, I guess. But again, don't torture yourself with these kinds of things. Only use them if they are helpful to you. And so we may not be in lab right now, but it's always a good time to talk about safety. So many of you, this may be your first opportunity to be introduced to a research lab setting on a typical week. And so it's very much like what we've done before in introductory labs, but now we're going to have another component of, right, you may be generating things that you don't know whether they're safe or not. So there's going to be an added level of doing some research and looking at how we determine how safe these things are. And so one of the best tools that you're going to have at your disposal is perfect for your lab notebook, is your standard operating procedure, which is sort of like it sounds, right? A almost list of exactly what you need to do, and also what to do when things go wrong, right? To assess the risks, as it says here. And so often, before any researcher begins an experiment, they'll create up an SOP. It'll be revised and then supervised by someone and then signed off on. So that number one, if anyone has any questions, they can go to it. But also, if something goes wrong, right, they're going to have a place where they can look at how they can fix these problems or assess what even might be going wrong if they're not sure. And it's no surprise, right? This is very similar to some of that Bloom's taxonomy and scientific method stuff that we were looking at before. This is just a very applied version. So here, what we're looking at is, reducing the risk and the hazard and the exposure in any given setting at any given time. And know that every type of experimentation comes with different hazards, so always speak to the people you're working with about something weird you may be using, or something you may not think about, but that may be around in lab. So this was one slide I couldn't fully modify because it's really sort of up in the air. This was an example of what I gave to them last year, just for comparison. So ideally, I love to be up just a little bit before 9 to get started on things. Usually I do emails in the morning, that's just how I work, and then I like to be on my feet early so I can get most of the experimentation done, hopefully, in the morning. That's usually never the case. And then in the afternoon, I look at the data and I crunch it or make a graph, whatever I need to do, maybe some writing as well. And that's like a bare minimum in the lab. There are many people who would say, from 8 to 5, that's nothing. And many people will work much more than you, and many people will work a lot less. What matters is that you work enough that works for you, right? It's impossible not to compare yourself to others, especially when you're in a program, but it's also never helpful. in certain ways. So I will admit, often there are also days where you don't get to dictate your schedule. Experiments may start up early. You may have a meeting or a phone call. Those multiply the further you go into research. And experiments don't work, right? So something you started in the morning may not come out in the afternoon. And so really, a good researcher is flexible, right? Not only able to, say, have a routine that they can stick to keep themselves productive with regards to writing and reading and whatnot, but also ready at a moment to be like, okay, we need to fix this entire machine, or, oh, something was wrong in the analysis, let's go all the way back. So it's really both ends. And now, the current era we're in really lends perfectly to, I guess, really building your own schedule. I personally find having something of, a bullet list to get me started is very helpful. But I'm not going to talk to you about what works for you. Hopefully you have discovered that or have begun to discover that. So I also want to talk briefly about digital files, right? So we have our lab notebook, that's the hard copy, but then we also have this mess of stuff, different types of stuff, right? Papers, articles, presentations, all these kinds of things. So this is a rough breakdown of something you might see after many years of finally getting the folders together, right? It takes time. I usually like to break things down sort of by file type, right? So slides are going to be all my PowerPoints. Those may be presentations, those may be lectures, things like that. You'll probably come up with a poster as part of a program. Even if you don't, it's a great exercise, right, to kind of organize your thoughts and your data. Those will be, probably PowerPoint as well. That's what I use for that. Then there is sort of the holy data file, which, is backed up in multiple places, right? We're not even talking about things like that. But I like to organize by instrument or maybe type of experiment you're doing. And then importantly, as I was mentioning a little bit before, with any given experiment, you're going to have, that raw data that comes out. You're going to have, however you averaged it or put it together, the process data, and then those final images. And you may even have many files in between here. My advice would be to really separate them and have them organized in a way that you really have a chronology of everything you've done. Because I know there's going to be some point in the future where you're going to want to look back at the great work you did and highlight it or use a part of it. And if you can't find it, that is a real shame. The way that I like to do this relates to the lab notebook, one of the reasons I like to use it. So the code you see here is actually the list you see under plotted data. So JSB1P95, that's my initials, JS. B1 is the first book, right? If you work at a place long enough, you may have many lab books. Page is the 95th page, and then in this case it says TGA. That would be for the specific, final plot. But now what I'm able to do is not only go all the way back from a published graph, perhaps, to a data point or a set of data points. It's going to be really easy to find any mistakes, or if someone wants to see something, help them out really quickly. I remember in grad school, I graduated, and I was being asked to finish publishing a paper, and I was so glad that I had it in this format because they had to use a certain software and do it to essentially change the look of everything. And if I didn't have it in this format, there's almost no way it could have gotten done. So, again, even if you're not, organizing thing every day, which isn't necessary, every once in a while, just making sure that things are cleaned up and accessible. I guess also just going on the far left here, the red ones, I like to put all my literature in one place, if possible. All of my writing, and then you're going to have a lot of reports and other things you're going to start to, create. And then also any administrative stuff, right? Any things you've signed or, anything you want to keep a paper copy of. Okay, so, we're sort of moving through the research process here. We're more towards the end of, I guess, the experimentation and theory, right? We're talking big ideas. But I want to just discuss again about this relationship between Bloom's taxonomy and, in this case, the final paper that you're either going to write now or will write at some point. And I'm sure you are familiar with the article layout, right? You have a title at the top, you have your introduction, your methods, your results, discussion, conclusion, and references. And what is neat is you can kind of map these to Bloom's taxonomy a little bit. So I guess it's upside down here. But right, you're really going from recalling ideas in your introduction to understanding them and creating methods with them, to eventually putting ideas together, evaluating them, and then creating something with your conclusion. And that's nice, but something we found is that this linear process doesn't always suit us. And so what I found works very well for me when I'm starting to write is what I have on the far right here, right? References, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, introduction, title. And again, you may have your own format. But bets are, right, that before hopefully you really stepped into lab, you have all your references or you've compiled them throughout the process. So those are easy to put together. Methods are going to be really just what you did in lab. So I really like being able to just literally write what I did, right, and not have to think about how things relate or what connections are. And so as we work our way sort of up the pyramid, in this case we're going down the terms. But it's funny to have title at the very end here. But very often you don't really see the full picture until you've written everything else. And so, also when all that data is collected. And so I actually like to leave the title for the very, very end. And it usually comes to you a lot easier then as well. So yeah, this will be sort of later on in the research process, but right, realize that you're putting this stuff together as you go, right? Your references, that's your introduction, bait, I guess, and then also the setup for your experiments, and so it kind of progresses. I would love to talk at length about alternative methods of sharing our work, right? Dissemination, as we call it. So not just writing a paper, could be things like video, but also, connecting with people via social media. So this was from a talk even earlier on last year, where we were talking about how, people kind of have different personas, perhaps. Some people are just professional, some people are just personal on things like Twitter, if we're looking at one, resource. But that it really can be a great tool to connect with other people and learn about what's going on. And so even informally, if you're associated with these networks, it's a great way to get involved. And sort of, right, you're now being thrown into this world of a topic you maybe don't know anything about. It would be great to sort of learn what people are interested and excited about. And I bet you some of them are out there on Twitter. If you're interested, right, it's also now an opportunity for you to share the work you're doing. Maybe you solved a frustrating problem or have a question. And so Twitter can be a great resource for connecting with people. I also really like Reddit. And then there's a variety of other forums like Quora or other things, right, that you can use to source answers to tough questions. Not that, of course, hopefully your mentor isn't a great resource too. And so I want to point out that as we talked about, right, it's not usually just as simple as that cycle that we looked at. For many reasons, things go wrong all the time. And this is an error, right, where we're being very flexible and understanding when things don't really turn out how we expected. The good news is, especially, if you're not in lab and there's not boiling acid, you don't have to worry too much at first, right? You're going to be able to discuss with someone and come up with a plan or better options if something is, really worrisome. But know that also when it comes to things like individual experiments or projects, know that those are often, relative to the situation you're in, but also that everyone makes mistakes. I could go on for hours. It's sort of embarrassing, but, be it in lab or even in how you formatted something or an email you sent, we all make mistakes all the time. And we're all new, to different things about research, too, all the time, right? There's different things we're learning. So it's very common, and you shouldn't feel too bad about, if that comes up. So these are just a couple ideas. And then, the other neat thing about research is there really is time for you to begin to develop your interests and the style with which you approach problems and, what you care about, which sounds like a funny question, but in science is very relevant, with engineering too. So, right, you want to set aside time to not be bored, though I'm sure you may have time for that, but just to think critically about questions, right, without the context of others, but then also to come back and share ideas and then look at whether it's maybe been solved that way. There are going to be times in research where maybe you're not comfortable, right, with making the next step, not that you're, in harm's way, but if it'll work or not. Feel free to make mistakes too, right? There is going to be a lot of ground for you to practice and do things again. That's a lot of what science is, a lot of repetition. But the one thing we'll ask of you is that if you are going to make mistakes, which, again, very common, is to learn from them and grow from them. So really, we're not so, advisors, for example, aren't upset when you make mistakes. We get upset when you make the same mistakes again and again, which is human. But frustrating, right? And so that's some of the stuff that we'll work on together. Know that research isn't conducted in a silo, right? You're never going to be alone, even though you may feel alone at sometimes working, on a computer by yourself, or even, in the research you do in the lab, feel very alone. But know that, right, all of it comes in this greater context. And so not only do you have, hopefully, an advisor or PI that you're working with, other students, other people in your program. There's often people at the university level that may be able to help you too in terms of human resources, or even just other people in the department that may be able to just answer questions. And so I know it is tiring at times to kind of continually reach out, especially when you still don't have an answer to your problem. But I would doubt that your question is perhaps as unique as you think. Bets are other people are having it too. I will say, right, that in this time, people's schedules are really up in the air. And so, as good as it is to be reaching out when you have questions, it's also just, to be respectful. I'm going to hope that at this time you and your advisor would set out some sort of timeline of, what you're expected to work on and when, and what times of hours they can reach out. But generally, a once-a-week meeting is a great way to collect and summarize things. I'm a big fan of also having an agenda before you go into that meeting, maybe just a bullet list, to make sure that you're really on task. I hated going into meetings with my advisors where we hadn't anything specific to talk about, and then it was like we talked about things I didn't want to talk about forever. I don't think that happened too often, but it's always good to have a little schedule. Great opportunity in a program like a research program, but also just, during the summer as you jump into the research swimming pool to sort of practice networking. And I think Twitter's a great resource for that right now. Also, not when we're quarantined. But there's going to be a lot of good resources this summer, too, that go along with perhaps conferences. I can think about the Green Chemistry and Engineering Conference is going to have a happy hour. And so just to even get a sense of, again, what people are talking about. You'll be surprised who you bump into. I will say, as someone who is, I didn't think I was going to do this math. I started doing my research in 2009. So however long ago that is. It may start with tweeting, but then you can genuinely become friends with people, build up research partnerships. It really begins anywhere these days. So don't be afraid, I guess, to, put yourself out there. Now that you have something kind of cool to talk about, right? Your research. Not that you're not cool too, but I think you get what you mean. We talked about this early on, right? Going out for sort of your mental sanity, right? But also for, I guess, a little bit of inspiration too. And so you'll be surprised to find where your project pops up out in the real world, and right, hopefully you can begin to find those places yourself. But early on, right, it'll be interesting to see where maybe the materials you're using or the types of methods you're using are actually in other places. And so summer being a wonderful time to get out safely, hopefully you'll also begin to see, right, your research in the real world. And so make sure you take a little bit of time to do that too. And so I guess if I've hooked you this long, I'm going to keep talking just a little bit. So I want to go to sort of this third stage of the Bloom's taxonomy, scientific method, and then that really next step. And I wanted to sort of frame a lot of what we've talked about. And this is actually a set of methods that I use with my students to look at environmental pollutants and hazards in the environment. And really more than anything, it's just a really big revamp of what we've just done. So I want you to imagine for a moment that you're going to a wonderful undergraduate research presentation seminar at the end of your wonderful summer where we've all been allowed to meet in person, safely, I guess. Long story short, and you're choosing a cup to take with you. And so the question that I pose to my students at the beginning of most semesters is, which is the most environmentally friendly? So you may have had your own answer to which you would have chosen, right? Maybe you like, your nice sturdy mug. You think that it's going to be safer to use. Perhaps you're worried about the environment and you're thinking about the styrofoam, for example. And so what we do is we begin to think about all the different components that go into making something sustainable, a word that is very difficult and out of reach, much like perhaps many of the research questions that you'll be presented early on in your research, right? Very big, lofty questions. And so here what we do is we begin to think about all the different pieces and all the different parts and kind of how they connect. And so for those interested, it turns out that as long as you wash it more than 50 times, the ceramic mug is going to be your most environmentally friendly option. It does take a lot of energy and materials to create, but if you don't have to regenerate, right, all that paper or styrofoam, it turns out to be the best bet. And that's from the paper we see here, right? So through a whole study. And so one of the things I want to do now is talk about how we can create sort of at-home or online research in our current time. So specifically look at how we can use the methods that we've been discussing to develop an approach to tackle a variety of questions. And so the way that we kind of look at this is through the lens of what we call life cycle assessment. So that's really just a fancy term for what you do every day. When you come up against a problem, you evaluate different options and you choose the best option. This is just a fancy way that we can look at mostly material goods as a materials chemist. That's what I look at. You could look at energy, and I'm sure you could adapt this to other processes as well. But the big goal here is to go from what's known as the gate to gate, which is going to be like something that's trashed, to something that's cradle to cradle or something that's recyclable. So in this case, we're kind of connecting the output and the input to recreate the different resources we need. So again, maybe a little heady for right now, but let's just look at the basics and then we'll jump forward. So the simplest life cycle assessment that I could ask you to do, we've already done today, right, is come up with a list of different things to sort of map them out and then relate them or judge them, right, working up the different components of Bloom's taxonomy, for example. And so we talk about materials here. I look at literal materials, in this case, things like wood or ceramics and whatnot. But materials here are just going to be the components in whatever process you're looking at. So, right, sort of the dots. And then the flow are going to be the arrows, and we're going to connect these dots and then evaluate, right, what we have. And this is a very general version of how we look at, most problems, right? We collect data, we analyze it, and then we evaluate it. Now, looking at it from a sustainable perspective, we're going to look at three components while we do this, whether what I like to call the product, the process, or the people. This is Marcus Lemonis's tagline, but the premise is these three very distinct things, right? Material goods, that's products; processes, things that help, sort of transport or get us to where we're going, often energy; and then people, we're going to look at all of those societal impacts, so some of those environmental things. So we'll look at efficiency, we will look at sort of economy, and then we'll look at sort of society. And so what we do in this case is we take the scientific method, which we hopefully are becoming more comfortable with, and we kind of blend it with that Bloom's taxonomy. And so we come out with these cyclic assessments where it's better suited a little bit towards what you're actually doing when you're in lab, right? Even though you are hopefully going around the outer edge of this hexagon on the right, very often you're going back into the center and kind of choosing another route, right? Do I have to go backwards? Can I jump forwards? And so that's how I really like to think about the undergraduate research process or research process in general, even though it looks a little fanciful here. So the scientific method is kind of like how it should work theoretically, right, in a perfect world, and then the cyclic assessment is sort of more a model of what it looks like in our real world. And oh gosh, I thought I had so many more LCA slides. I'll probably do another one about that soon. But I also just want to point out the resources and people that I've worked with and used. And so, for example, the opportunity came last year from Claudia Bodie, who was putting together the REU with some others at KU. More recently, the Manhattan College School of Science, which has helped fund the research that will happen this summer. I want to point out not only, say, the institutions that I've been with, which have provided these opportunities for me, and some of the the current funding I have now, like from Beyond Benign, but also really importantly the partners that I've worked with, right? So that I haven't maybe been directly involved with, but now that I'm doing research, right? You have this wonderful opportunity to engage with so many other people under this this cause, whatever it may be for your problem or project. And so the Green Chemistry Institute, an engineering organization, the USDA, all groups that I definitely would never have gotten to hang out with if it hadn't been for the the research I had done. And so I would say sort of craftily use your position as a researcher now, or as a growing researcher, to also make bridges that you've been wanting to work on, to work with groups or partners that are doing really cool work. You'll have the luxury of being able to reach out at the end of the summer and asking about internships and opportunities in the future with this experience behind you. And so there we are. Those are kind of my best tips and tricks of kind of understanding the undergraduate research process and what might serve you. I hope it gives you some help this summer. I know we're all in kind of funny times, but the neat thing is that there still is a lot of really great research to be done at home. and a lot of good learning to be done early on, right? A lot of your early work as a researcher is reading anyway, so find a good, comfortable place and read safely, I would say, for this first part of the summer for sure. And if you have any further questions, you can always reach me at Manhattan College. And feel free to join us in the chemistry department in the fall. I am teaching, I'm not sure what I'm teaching. I think I'm teaching 101. So I hope you have a great, productive summer of research. You know that many have not. Many have just enjoyed the skills that they've learned, and it maybe wasn't so productive, but it was in that, you always grow from the experience. So best of luck. Good luck with the challenges specifically, and hope to see you at a presentation soon.